Not so long ago, I reviewed the Emoji Movie. See the link to that video in the description. I ultimately came to the conclusion that, while an awful movie, it was a mediocre paint-by-numbers style piece of garbage that was, above all else, very forgettable. So today, by comparison, I'd like to discuss an animated film that was less a paint-by-numbers lazy cash grab and more of an absolute flaming dumpster fire. Quite possibly the worst animated movie that I've ever seen in my life. And that, my friends, is Norm of the North. Unlike the bland, pathetically unoriginal fluff that the Emoji Movie gave us, this movie right here is the perfect storm of a nonsensical plot, aggravating characters, painfully unfunny jokes, and even the animation itself is trash. So, without further ado, it's time to talk about it. What went wrong with Norm of the North? I know a lot of people have made that joke about this movie. You know the one.
Rob Schneider, derp-de-derp. Derp-de-derpity-derpy-derp.
But in all honesty, I'm kind of convinced that Rob Schneider is a polar bear was the only starting idea behind this movie. It's like the producers decided they wanted Rob Schneider as a polar bear, but had absolutely no idea how to actually build a cohesive plot around the concept. Because, oh wow, this movie's narrative is completely nonsensical. The Emoji Movie was one of those films where, when you actually stood back and thought about it, the plot didn't make much sense. Here, you don't even need to think about it. This plot is so bafflingly nonsensical that the problems are too blatant for that. Okay, let me explain the story. Norm is a polar bear living in the Arctic who has inherited the ability to talk to humans. Why and how? Not explained, moving along. Norm lives mostly in peace and likes to perform for tourists by twerking. But anyway, one day he finds that someone has built a house in the Arctic. Not a research lab, but a typical everyday living condo. If your immediate thought is that the average human could not possibly survive in the extreme conditions of the Arctic their entire lives, and wouldn't want to anyway, then I am sorry, because the movie is relying on us not considering such a fact. I mean, obviously a movie set in the Arctic is likely to have some kind of commentary on environmentalism, but here's the thing. Of all of the hazards that threaten the Arctic, I'm fairly certain human housing and habitation isn't one of them. Of course, there are plenty of environments that do suffer from habitat loss due to human habitation and development, but the Arctic is not one of them. Either set the film in, like, a forest, or make it about, I don't know, Arctic drilling. Anyway, Norm, not realising the idea of humans living in the Arctic is ludicrous, sets out to put a stop to the housing corporation. Now, as it turns out, the corporation who came up with this idea has next to no support for it. Okay, fair enough, that is actually realistic. Except, by all logic, this means Norm doing absolutely nothing would be the best course of action. Nonetheless, because he doesn't know any better, and we need this movie to have what could be described as a plot, he decides to step in and save the day, even though it doesn't really need saving. His plan to stop the corporation is by being super famous, then infiltrating the corporation as a spokesperson and calling them out. Right, okay, so becoming famous and beloved by the public, then calling out the corporation, makes sense. Infiltrating the corporation to sabotage them from the inside also makes sense. But doing both of these things at once does not. If Norm is famous and loved, then why work for the corporation at all when that'll just increase its popularity? Norm could just be independent and then call them out. The only popularity he's aiming to destroy is the popularity that he himself creates. So when he's falsely shown as supporting the company, well, I can't exactly feel sympathy for him given he himself did most of the work. Oh, and I need to mention exactly how Norm becomes famous. First of all, everyone just thinks he's a human in a bear costume. Why and how do they not see he's clearly a real bear? Not explained, moving along. But what is the act that makes him a darling in the eyes of the public? He stops a shooting. No, seriously, that's how. Admittedly, it's just a tranquilizer gun, but nonetheless, that's some interesting imagery there, huh? Oh, and the person he stops is in fact the CEO of the corporation, Mr. Green. Right, Norm, for the love of God, you have the ample opportunity right now to call him out and expose him as a bad guy. What are you doing? Take advantage of that, or use it to ruin his career. But no, he decides to still enact his plan of becoming the face of the company, then turning on them. Except why on earth would Norm's newfound popularity increase the reputation of the company when it was the CEO of said company that he had to stop attacking a restaurant? Surely they'd still view Mr. Green in a bad light. Anyway, while I previously said Norm doing nothing would have been the best option, turns out he does have a meaningful role after all, because Mr. Green kidnapped his grandpa. How? Why? Not explained, moving along. So now the plot is Norm having to stop houses being built in the Arctic, saving his grandpa, and also befriending the daughter of one of Mr. Green's workers. She isn't particularly relevant to the plot, but I guess we needed a cute kid protagonist for the youngsters to relate to. There is honestly more I could have mentioned, but I think that more or less explains why the plot is as bad as it is. Nothing makes sense. Just because the movie is animated and aimed at kids doesn't mean you can just throw anything on screen and expect it to entertain. Kids aren't that dumb. But on top of a terrible plot, this film, unsurprisingly, has pretty terrible characters too. Norm himself is very bland and difficult to root for given just how much he ruins everything and just how little he thinks things through. Norm's new co-worker Vera and her daughter Olympia are your typical cliché parent who spends too much time at work and not enough time with their child situation. Neither are very interesting nor memorable. Then there's Mr. Green, who is quite frankly an awful excuse for a villain. Despite being the typical evil anti-environment CEO that you find in most kids' films like this, he's presented almost like a new age hippie type. I mean, his name is literally Mr. Green, which could have worked if they'd actually put some thought into the character, like a villain who's an out-of-touch rich kid obsessed with trendy fads like environmentalism, who's too dense to realise that their attempts to connect with the natural world is doing more harm than good. That's not a bad idea. Unfortunately, I guess the writers couldn't think of how to properly create such a character or write proper ironic humour, so they just decided to give up and resort to the typical greedy CEO cliches. But Mr. Green isn't the worst character, of course. No, that would be the Minion Lemmings. Yeah, Norm has these three voiceless sidekicks that are quite clearly trying to emulate the minions from Despicable Me. Now, the minions themselves are already annoying, but these lemmings not only up the ante on aggravation, given their only purpose in the movie is unfunny toilet humour, but they are absolutely horrible to look at. I mean, I don't like the minions, but I can see why many folks find their simplistic design to be cute, whereas these repulsive things are impossible to find endearing. And this brings me to the next big problem, the animation. While the Emoji Movie at the very least looked nice, this movie couldn't even accomplish that. The animation looks very cheap and really shows that this movie was intended to be straight to DVD. But what really stands out as bad are the character designs. Honestly, I think whoever made this movie had no idea how to translate basic character design into a CGI style, because a lot of the issues stem from that. Most of the characters look plastic, the fur isn't right, and they keep trying to do rubbery squash and stretch animation that really doesn't translate well to CGI. This is especially apparent with Mr. Green and the Lemmings, both of which, though cartoonish in proportion, are still too detailed and realistic to make any of this work, and it often results in uncanny valley awkwardness. Truth be told, I have nothing good to say about this movie. It genuinely is the worst animated movie I've ever had the displeasure of watching. So, if that's what went wrong, how would I put it right? Well, for starters, have the plot make sense. You cannot have a movie with an environmentalist message about human habitation and set it in a completely uninhabitable landscape. Either have Norm be going up against an oil drilling company or a mining company or just climate change in general, or make him a bear living in a forest that's being levelled for new housing. In fact, you could technically do both. Have him be a polar bear living in the Arctic whose home is ruined because of climate change, so he has to resort to leading his family to a snowy forest in North America. Then at first have him competing with the grizzly bears he finds there and build up a rivalry, which would play the fish out of water story in a much more interesting manner than just a cliche wild animal in the city plot. Then have them have to come together to face off against a housing corporation that wants to level their home to make room for unnecessary human habitation. And make Mr. Green a more interesting character by having him be a genuine spaced out new age spoiled rich guy who's oblivious to the damage he's causing and insists he's building luxury condos in the forest in order to bring people, i.e. his rich friends, closer to nature. Rather than just having him being a boring, stereotypical evil CEO, actually build the comedy around the irony of him claiming to speak for nature while doing all he can to destroy it. On top of that, this could actually give him a reason to want to kidnap Norm's grandpa. Have him come across him in the woods and insist on capturing him and making him his own precious personal pet, because he supposedly wants to care for the plight of the polar bear and its lost Arctic home, trying to build good publicity. And instead of having Norm being able to interact with humans for no explained reason, just focus on his interactions with the grizzly bears as he learns the ways of their forest and they learn that they aren't so different after all. It's, a nice coming together story as well as an environmentalist story. But obviously, no matter how the movie went, it'd have to look very different from the original. The concept of the original movie was basically just Rob Schneider is a polar bear. There's a lot to be improved there because that's not a story. A polar bear family and a grizzly bear family learning to work together as they lose their homes thanks to human activity is, at the very least, a basic concept. But of course, it would still rely on the writing being a lot less lazy. Even the best concept and story ideas would be ruined by writers who thought that any of the original was a good, well thought out idea. Is there a lesson to be learned from Norm of the North? Well, this film didn't do so well at the box office and was absolutely hated by the critics. So I'd say if there's a message to take from that, it's this. Just because a film is animated and or aimed at children doesn't mean you can or should just cut as many corners as possible and churn out a lazy product with no creativity put into it whatsoever. Animated movies have proven that they can be impressively artistic, genuinely moving, worthy of awards, and that they can provide stellar entertainment for kids and adults, again and again and again. There's just no excuse for a proper big budget movie studio to make churned out garbage like this anymore. If you can afford a decent writing team, then hire them. Kids aren't that stupid. They deserve better entertainment than this, and when there are so many better animated movies on the market right now, they aren't going to settle for garbage like this anymore. And that, my friends, is exactly what went wrong. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then like, share and subscribe and all that jazz. If there's a movie you'd like me to review next, then be sure to mention it in the comments. And if you think there does exist an animated movie out there worse than Norm of the North, be sure to mention that too, as I'm certainly interested in checking it out. Anyway, hope you all keep watching in future, and goodbye!